Civilizations can collapse with terrifying speed. This is what happened across Europe as the great Roman cities fell into ruin. Trade routes vanished, governments dissolved, and the shared knowledge of a continent teetered on the edge of oblivion. Yet in the midst of this gathering darkness, a quiet rescue mission was already underway. This is the story of how monastic scriptoria preserved knowledge while Europe's cities declined. By the end, you will understand the precise, almost miraculous chain of events that saved the core ideas of our world from being erased entirely. We will uncover why remote monasteries became fortresses for books, how a monk's daily prayer was also an act of intellectual defiance, and what ancient choices determine the books we can still read today. What does it truly take to save a civilization's memory from the silence of history? The empire's great arteries began to fail. Those magnificent Roman roads, engineered for legions and commerce, slowly surrendered to meadow grass and encroaching forest. The constant hum of carts and travelers faded into a deep, unsettling quiet. This silence was not peaceful. It was the sound of systems breaking down. From the 5th century onward, the vibrant urban centers that had been the heartbeat of the Roman world, places like Rome itself, Milan, Trier, and countless others, began a long, slow contraction. They did not vanish overnight, but they shrank, their populations dwindling as the complex machinery that sustained them ground to a halt. Centralized Roman administration, that vast bureaucratic network that had once coordinated everything from grain shipments to tax collection across continents, simply dissolved. Without that framework, long-distance trade became perilous and then nearly impossible. The flow of goods, Spanish olive oil, Egyptian grain, Syrian glass, slowed to a trickle and then stopped. An economy built on specialization and exchange fractured into countless isolated, self-sufficient pockets. If you could not grow it, make it, or barter for it within a few miles of your village, you likely went without. This economic localization forced a dramatic demographic shift. People left the vulnerable, resource-hungry cities for the countryside, where they could be closer to food and land, tying their survival to local lords and fortified villages rather than distant emperors. This fragmentation reshaped everything. Political power, once concentrated in imperial capitals, shattered into a mosaic of small kingdoms, dukedoms, and chiefdoms, each with its own shifting borders and loyalties. Social structures transformed as well, with local strongmen and their bands of warriors becoming the new centers of authority, far removed from the old ideals of civic duty and Roman law. In this new, fragmented world, what became of knowledge? The great urban libraries, the public schools, the secular scholars who once debated in bustling forums. These institutions required stability, wealth, and a critical mass of people to sustain them. They required cities, and as the city lights faded across Europe, they left behind a profound and dangerous vacuum. The very idea of preserving knowledge on a large scale, of maintaining a continuous thread of learning from one generation to the next, was becoming unsustainable in the secular world. A darkness was gathering, not just of night but of forgetting. Yet in that gathering gloom, a new kind of light was being kindled, not in the palaces of kings, but in the remote, walled communities of men who had chosen a life of prayer and isolation. Into this landscape of fragmentation stepped a radical new kind of community. While the old world of cities and empires crumbled, a spiritual revolution was quietly building a different future in the wilderness. Men and women, seeking a life of purpose beyond the chaos, began withdrawing to remote places, forests, mountains, and river valleys far from the crumbling roads. They were not fleeing society to be alone, but to build something new and durable from the ground up. This was the monastic movement, and its most influential architect in the West was a man named Benedict of Nursia. In the 6th century, Benedict wrote a simple but profound guide for communal living called the Rule. This document did not just outline prayers, it engineered a complete and self-contained world. Its core principles were stability, obedience, and community. A monk vowed to remain in one monastery for life, creating a permanence utterly foreign to the turbulent world outside. He vowed obedience to an abbot and to the rhythm of the rule itself, replacing the lost order of Roman law with a new spiritual discipline. And he lived not as a hermit, but as part of a brotherhood where every task, no matter how humble, had sacred purpose. This structure created something Europe desperately lacked: islands of predictable stability in a sea of chaos. But there was another, crucial element woven into the daily fabric of Benedictine life, a practice called Lectio Divina, or divine reading. This was not reading for information or entertainment. It was a slow, meditative, and prayerful engagement with sacred texts, primarily the Bible and the writings of early church thinkers. The rule mandated hours for this spiritual work each day, making the act of reading itself a form of prayer and a direct path to understanding the divine. This created a powerful, non-negotiable demand for books within the monastery walls. To perform Lectio Divina, the community needed copies of Scripture. To teach new monks, they needed texts. To sustain their liturgical life, the 8 daily prayer services known as the Opus Dei, or Work of God, they needed psalters and hymnals. The monastery's entire spiritual engine required a steady supply of written words, so by their very purpose, these communities became reservoirs for books. Their remote locations, chosen for isolation and peace, inadvertently protected them from the political storms and conflicts that ravaged population centers. Their disciplined routine provided the daily framework within which scholarly work could consistently happen, and their spiritual mandate transformed the preservation of texts from a scholarly hobby into a holy obligation. The scriptorium, the room where books were copied, did not emerge as an afterthought. It was the necessary workshop that supplied the monastery's most vital fuel. Before a single line of classical philosophy could be saved for the future, the conditions to save anything at all had to exist. In the quiet, disciplined world of the monastery, those conditions were now being met, not by kings or emperors, but by the daily rhythm of prayer and work. A single lamp illuminated the vellum before him, its flickering light casting long shadows across the quiet scriptorium. In that hushed space, a monk's work began not with a thought for posterity, but with a prayer. His hand, guided by a discipline honed over years, dipped a quill into ink made from oak galls and began to trace a letter. This was not simple clerical work. Each stroke, each curve of a C, each precise dot of an I was considered an act of devotion, a physical prayer inscribed onto the page. The labor was immense. A single book, like a complete Bible, could take one scribe the better part of a year to copy. They worked through stiff fingers in the winter cold and by the dimmest of light to preserve precious candles. Why endure such hardship for a task so tedious? The answer lies at the very heart of the monastic calling. For these scribes, transcription was a sacred mission, a labor of love for God. They believed that by meticulously copying the sacred scriptures and the approved writings of the early church fathers, they were participating in divine work. They were not just preserving words, they were disseminating truth and building a fortress against error. In an age where distant communities might only hear a corrupted version of a gospel passage once a year, the accurate text held in a monastery was a lifeline. A single mistake in copying a passage of scripture could, in their view, lead a whole community into heresy. Therefore, accuracy was a spiritual duty. The scribe saw himself as a conduit, a careful channel through which divine wisdom flowed unchanged to future generations. This profound sense of purpose provided the relentless, enduring drive necessary for such painstaking work. As historian Rosamund McKitterick has emphasized, This religious imperative created a consistency of effort that simply did not exist in the secular world outside the monastery walls. While a city's schools might close and its scholars scatter, the monastic scribe, bound by his vow of stability and his daily liturgical rhythm, would return to his desk day after day, season after season. This transformed the scriptorium from a mere workshop into a true sanctuary for the written word. The value of the text was inseparable from its holiness. A beautifully copied gospel was not just a source of information, it was a sacred object in itself, worthy of ornate covers and precious jewels. This devotional framework meant that the act of preservation was built into the daily life of the community, as routine and as essential as the prayers that marked the hours. The survival of knowledge became a byproduct of their search for spiritual perfection, but this sacred focus also raises a critical question. If their primary mission was to copy religious texts, how did the great works of a pagan classical past, the philosophy of Plato, the science of Galen, the epic poetry of Virgil, find their way onto those same parchment pages? The answer lies in a surprising and pragmatic adaptation of their holy task. The monastic scribe did not work in just any room. He worked in a machine built for a single purpose, a space engineered by centuries of quiet observation to coax perfect letters from a human hand. This was the scriptorium, and its design was as deliberate as the rule that governed the monk's day. Often, it was the warmest and brightest room in the entire complex, a precious allocation of comfort in a life of austerity. Its windows were strategically placed, frequently facing the steady, shadowless northern light, a natural, unchanging lamp that illuminated the page without glare for the maximum number of hours. Some scriptoria were even built into the cloister walk itself, that covered galleries surrounding the peaceful garden, turning the very architecture of contemplation into a workshop for the mind. Inside, the furniture was specialized. A scribe sat at a sloping desk, angled to ease the strain on his back and wrist during the long, motionless hours. He might use a weighted reading stand to hold the precious original text steady, his eyes moving constantly from the exemplar to his own fresh sheet of vellum. Every element, from the thickness of the stone walls that muted outside noise to the careful placement of heat sources to keep ink from freezing, was a solution to a practical problem of preservation. But the architecture was only part of the system. The true genius of this ecosystem was its integration of space, time, and rule. The scriptorium operated within the monastery's sacred schedule, its hours of work framed by the call to communal prayer. This imposed a rhythm, breaking the immense task of copying into manageable, daily portions. More importantly, the rule of silence, observed in many houses during work hours, was not merely a spiritual discipline. It was a profound cognitive tool, in that enforced quiet, broken only by the scratch of quills or the turning of a page, a monk could achieve a state of deep, uninterrupted concentration almost impossible to find in the outside world. His entire environment, the protected walls, the regulated day, the culture of quiet focus shielded the fragile act of thinking and writing from the chaos beyond the gates. Contrast this with the conditions in what remained of the towns. There, the unpredictable dangers of conflict, the pressing daily struggle for security and food, and the lack of any centralized, stable institution made sustained intellectual projects a near fantasy. The monastery did not just house knowledge, it cultivated the very conditions necessary for knowledge to be handled, a stable climate for delicate cultural seedlings. In this way, the stones of the cloister and the silence of the brethren became active, silent partners in the work. They created a sanctuary not just for souls but for sentences. Yet, even within this sanctuary, a pressing practical challenge remained. The demand for texts was constant, but the raw material for books was astonishingly scarce and expensive. How did these communities, often remote and self-sufficient, solve the immense logistical puzzle of producing the parchment, ink, and binding needed to stock their libraries. The vellum itself was a testament to an immense economic undertaking. That single, flawless sheet of calfskin stretched on the scribe's desk represented the end product of a vast and carefully managed enterprise. To understand the scriptorium, you must look beyond its quiet walls to the rolling fields, bustling workshops, and complex ledgers that sustained it. Monasteries were not isolated hermitages living hand to mouth. They became, by necessity, some of the most sophisticated economic institutions of the early Middle Ages. Their survival and their scholarly mission depended on a foundation of remarkable self-sufficiency. This was the third, crucial pillar of preservation: economic resilience. While the cities struggled, monastic communities often controlled large tracts of land known as granges or estates. These were not simple farms but diversified agricultural centers managed with a long-term vision that mirrored the monks' own vow of stability. They practiced crop rotation, raised livestock, maintained vineyards and orchards, and managed forests. This generated a consistent surplus. The sale of wool from vast sheep flocks, or wine from their vineyards, or surplus grain, created a steady stream of revenue. This wealth was the lifeblood of the scriptorium. It paid for the expensive materials that made books possible. Consider the process. To produce a single Bible required the skins of dozens, sometimes over 100, carefully raised calves or sheep. The animals were a product of the monastery's own herds or a major purchase from its income. The skins then underwent a lengthy, labor-intensive process of soaking, liming, scraping, and stretching to become the smooth, durable parchment scribes needed. This work was done by skilled lay brothers or specialized artisans within the monastic family. Similarly, ink was not bought from a shop. It was manufactured on site from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, each ingredient sourced or traded for. The brilliant pigments for illuminated initials, vibrant blues from lapis lazuli, radiant reds from vermilion, were often imported over great distances at significant cost, a luxury funded by the monastery's economic strength. This self-contained system created a powerful buffer. When external trade routes seized up and urban markets collapsed, the monastery's scriptorium could often continue its work uninterrupted. Its supply chain was internal, protected within the walls of its own lands and workshops. Furthermore, this economic model attracted patronage. A local noble family seeking spiritual merit might donate a parcel of fertile land to a monastery. That land would then produce food and revenue for generations, directly subsidizing the creation of books. In this way, the prayer of a scribe was supported by the labor of a shepherd, the skill of a tanner, and the management of a cellarer. The entire community, from field to library, was integrated into a single mission. The quiet copying in the scriptorium was, therefore, the delicate tip of a vast and sturdy economic iceberg. Without this foundation of material wealth and organized production, the spiritual desire to preserve texts would have remained a dream, stifled by the simple, crushing cost of parchment and ink. The monks did not just save ideas, they built the entire economy required to keep those ideas alive. The true cost of a single page was measured not in coins but in labor. Before a scribe could even lift his quill, a small army of specialized craftsmen had already completed their own meticulous tasks. It began with the skin of a calf, sheep, or goat, freshly removed from an animal raised on the monastery's own land. This raw hide was far from a writing surface. It was soaked for days in running water to cleanse it, then submerged in a vat of lime solution to loosen the hair. Next came the most demanding physical work, the scraping. A monk or skilled lay brother would stretch the skin over a curved beam called a hearse, and with a crescent-shaped knife, he would painstakingly scrape away every last bit of flesh and hair from the underside. This required immense strength and perfect control. A single slip could ruin the entire skin. After scraping, it was washed again, then stretched taut on a wooden frame to dry. a process that tightened the collagen fibers and created a smooth, taut surface. Finally, it was polished with pumice stone and chalk, transforming a rough animal skin into a pristine, creamy white sheet of parchment, ready to receive ink. This was not paper, it was a resilient membrane, a surface that could last for 1,000 years. The scribe's ink was equally a product of careful alchemy. The most common and enduring type was iron gall ink, a recipe that mixed science with local sourcing. They would collect oak galls, those hard, round growths formed on oak trees by wasp larvae. These galls were rich in tannic acid. They were crushed and soaked in rainwater, often in an iron pot, which would introduce iron sulfate into the mixture. The chemical reaction between the tannins and the iron created a soluble, pale gray liquid that, when exposed to the air as it was written, oxidized into a deep, permanent black. A binder like gum arabic was added to give it the right viscosity to cling to the quill and flow smoothly. For his pen, the scribe turned to the goose. A primary flight feather from the bird's wing was selected, hardened with gentle heat, and then its tip was cut and slit with a special knife called a pen knife, creating a nib that could produce both fine hairlines and bold, thick strokes. And for the glorious colors of illumination, the process became even more exotic and costly. Vivid blue came from powdered lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone mined in distant Afghanistan and traded across continents. Bright red vermilion was made from toxic mercury sulfide, and rich gold leaf was hammered so thin it could float on a breath before being carefully applied. Every component, from the local oak gall to the far-traveled lapis, represented a chain of knowledge and trade. This toolkit reveals a profound truth. The scribe was not merely a copyist, he was the final stage in a vast, integrated manufacturing process that thrived entirely within the rural monastic economy. Where urban workshops for book production had vanished, the monastery had internalized the entire craft, from animal husbandry to chemistry to metallurgy. His unwavering patience at the desk was supported by the unwavering skill of his brothers in the tannery, the workshop, and the apothecary. To write was to command an entire universe of materials, each one prepared by hand with a purpose that stretched across generations. The scribe's quill did not race across the page. It moved with a deliberate, measured pace, governed by a discipline that extended far beyond his wrist. His entire mind was trained to resist the most natural human impulse in copying, to read for meaning. Instead, he worked letter by letter, often using a ruler or a piece of thread to follow a single line of text in the original manuscript, the exemplar, before replicating it exactly on his fresh sheet of vellum. He copied shapes, not words. This method, painstaking and slow, was a deliberate defense against error. By focusing purely on the form of each character, he avoided the brain's tendency to skip ahead, to substitute a familiar phrase, or to unconsciously correct what seemed like a mistake in the source. His goal was not to understand the sentence as he wrote it, but to replicate its physical truth with absolute fidelity. The silence of the scriptorium was not empty, it was a tool. In that profound quiet, broken only by the steady scratch of nib on parchment, his concentration could achieve a laser-like focus. Distraction was a spiritual failing and a practical danger. A single moment of wandering thought could mean omitting a crucial knot in a philosophical argument or transposing numbers in a medical recipe, errors that could render the copied text useless or, worse, dangerously wrong for future readers. This was the ora et labora ideal in its purest form, prayer and work fused into a single, mindful action. The physical toll of this focus was immense. Monastic records and even the scribe's own notes in the margins of manuscripts speak of frozen fingers in unheated rooms, of eyes strained and failing from the dim light, of backs permanently curved from hours bent over the desk. One weary scribe, perhaps on a long winter afternoon, might pen a small plea in the margin, a rare personal touch in an impersonal task, something like, "The ink is thin, the parchment is hairy, and the day is dark." Yet he would continue. To manage the sheer volume of text, scribes developed a sophisticated system of abbreviations, a kind of medieval shorthand. Common words or endings were represented by specific symbols, a curled line over a letter to indicate a missing M or N, or a unique mark for the word et, meaning and. This saved precious time and space on expensive parchment, but it required the scribe and any future reader to be deeply literate in this coded language. Even with this intense focus, errors did occur. The correction methods reveal their commitment to integrity. A mistake might be carefully scraped away with a knife, the parchment rubbed smooth again, and the correct letter written over it. For larger errors, they might draw a delicate pointing hand called a manicule in the margin to note an addition, or simply cross out the wrong text with a neat line and write the correction above it. Nothing was simply erased and forgotten. The correction was made transparently, a record of their human fallibility and their dedication to fixing it. This entire ecosystem of discipline, from the enforced silence to the letter-by-letter method to the formal correction codes, served one paramount goal: transmission without corruption. When the text being copied was not a psalm but a complex treatise by Aristotle on logic or a detailed medical text by Galen describing the human body, this fidelity was everything. A miscopied diagram of a plant, a transposed measurement in an architectural formula, or a confused philosophical term could break the chain of understanding for centuries. The monastic scribe in his silent cell was therefore the guardian of a signal, ensuring it passed from the ancient world to the future with as little static as possible. His physical hardship was the price paid for intellectual clarity, but this raises a pivotal and often misunderstood point. If their sacred duty was to copy scripture and church writings, how did the works of pagan philosophers and scientists even find a place on that carefully prepared parchment? The bridge between the sacred scriptorium and the classical past was built by a handful of extraordinary scholar monks, men who saw no contradiction between faith and the pursuit of all knowledge. The quiet scriptorium held more than psalters and prayer books. It held secrets from a world the monks had never known. Alongside the Gospels and the writings of St. Augustine, you could find the epic poetry of Virgil, the elegant orations of Cicero, and even the dense philosophical dialogues of Plato. This was not a contradiction, but a crucial adaptation. The monastic mind, trained to seek truth, recognized that truth could wear many guises. To teach a young monk to read and write Latin, the sacred language of the Church, what better textbook existed than the flawless prose of Cicero? His speeches on duty and justice became exercises in grammar and moral philosophy, a bridge between language and virtue. The epic tales of Virgil, with their themes of fate, piety, and founding cities, were read not as pagan myth, but as profound literature that could illuminate human nature and even, in a symbolic way, prefigure Christian themes. A scholar monk named Cassiodorus in the 6th century made this philosophy explicit. He argued that the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy were the essential handmaidens to theology. One could not fully understand the divine word without first mastering the human tools of language, number, and reason. This created a powerful intellectual justification for preserving the classical past. A text on geometry was not just about shapes, it revealed the harmonious order of God's creation. A medical treatise by the Greek physician Galen was a guide to the intricate, God-given machine of the human body, and thus a work of practical charity. Monasteries, as centers of healing for their communities, had a direct need for such knowledge. Their libraries became eclectic treasure chests. Alongside St. Jerome's letters, you might find Roman legal codes like the Theodosian Code, vital for administering the monastery's own lands and settling disputes. Practical manuals on agriculture, viticulture, and animal husbandry were copied and studied, directly supporting the economic engine that fueled the scriptorium itself. Astronomical charts needed to calculate the ever-shifting date of Easter, preserved complex mathematical and observational knowledge from antiquity. This was not a systematic preservation program. It was a pragmatic, often piecemeal rescue. A text survived because a particular abbot valued it, because it served a practical need in the classroom or the infirmary, or simply because a single, curious monk found it fascinating. The classical flame did not burn brightly in every house. In some monasteries, secular works were viewed with deep suspicion. In others, they were studied with intense, almost reverent interest. Monks would often copy a classical text and then surround it with layers of commentary, interpreting its passages through a Christian lens, baptizing the old wisdom for a new age. This process of glossing and commentary was itself an act of intellectual preservation, weaving the ancient thread into the fabric of medieval thought. The result was a fragile but continuous chain. While the great public libraries of Rome had turned to dust, a single, precious copy of Cicero's On Duties could survive for centuries on a remote Irish island or in a Swiss mountain valley, tended by men who saw in its elegant Latin a tool for building better minds in the service of God. The diversity of their collections reveals a profound truth. They were not just saving religion, they were saving the foundational tools of civilization itself, its laws, its science, its stories, and its methods of thinking. But this scattered, fragile network of knowledge faced an existential threat. As the 8th century dawned, a new wave of conflict and disruption swept across Europe, one that would test the very walls that sheltered these precious books. The quiet labor of the scribe was only one part of a greater system. For every book carefully copied, a more profound question remained: where would it go, and who would decide its fate? The answer lay in the hands of a figure who stood at the very heart of the monastery's intellectual life, the librarian, known as the armarius. He was far more than a custodian of shelves. He was the keeper of the sacred flame, a scholar administrator whose quiet decisions would echo for centuries. His domain was the library, a room of profound symbolic weight. In a world without external hard drives or cloud storage, this collection of codices was the monastery's collective memory, its treasury of wisdom, and its direct intellectual link to both God and the ancient past. The armarius understood that these books were not merely objects. They were the vessels of the community's soul and its primary tool for understanding the divine. His first and most critical duty was acquisition. How did new texts enter this closed world? Sometimes it was through deliberate exchange. A monk might travel to a distant monastery, and as part of a formal visit, scribes would exchange copies of texts each house lacked, a slow-motion network of intellectual barter. A wealthy patron might donate a precious book as a pious gift, or, in rarer cases, the monastery's own resources might be used to commission the copying of a particularly desired work from an outside source. Every new arrival crossed the librarian's desk for evaluation. He had to be a discerning judge of content, authenticity, and physical condition. Was this text theologically sound? Was it useful for teaching, for the liturgy, or for practical knowledge like medicine or agriculture? Did its handwriting suggest it was a reliable copy, or was it corrupted with errors? The armarius made the first, crucial filter on what knowledge was worthy of entering the monastery's permanent collection. Once a text was accepted, his organizational genius took over. He maintained the library's catalogue, a master list that was the key to finding anything in an age before standardized page numbers or alphabetical order by author. Books were often listed by their opening words, their subject, or their physical location on a specific shelf or in a specific chest. Security was paramount. Books were immensely valuable, sometimes literally worth their weight in silver. They were often chained to their reading desks or locked in heavy chests, not out of secrecy, but to protect the community's irreplaceable assets from theft or careless damage. The librarian held the keys, both literal and metaphorical. His most influential role, however, was in production. He was the direct link between the library's contents and the scriptorium's output. It was the armarius who decided which texts from the collection were most urgently needed in new copies. He would assign a specific work to a scribe, providing the precious exemplar from the secured library. In this act, he performed a subtle but powerful kind of editing. By choosing to have a work by the Roman historian Livy recopied before a volume of local sermons, he was casting a vote for what knowledge was most vital to preserve for the future. The slow decay of parchment meant that even cherished books would eventually crumble unless a new copy was made. The librarian's schedule of replication was a continuous triage, a quiet battle against time and entropy. In rare instances, the opposite decision might be made. A text deemed heretical, redundant, or simply too damaged to justify the immense cost of recopying might be allowed to fade away. The parchment could be scraped clean and reused for a new text, a process called palimpsesting, or the book might simply sit untouched until it fell apart. These were not acts of malice, but of brutal prioritization within a system of limited resources. Every choice to copy one text was by necessity a choice not to copy another. In this way, the anonymous armarius, through his daily judgments of utility, orthodoxy, and condition, became one of history's most influential curators. He did not write the books, but he determined which ones would have a future. The intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages, and thus the classical heritage that flowed into the Renaissance, was shaped in no small part by the priorities of these scholarly guardians, working by lamplight to feed the hungry pens of the scribes. The scribe's work was precise, but the illuminator's was transcendent. In the margins of those same painstakingly copied texts, a parallel world of color and symbol bloomed. This was not mere embellishment. It was a visual theology, a silent sermon painted in the most precious materials on earth. The illuminator worked with a palette of meaning. The radiant blue that framed the Virgin Mary often came from lapis lazuli, a stone mined in distant Afghanistan and carried across continents at immense cost. This specific blue was not chosen for convenience. It was chosen because it represented the vault of heaven, the divine truth itself. A brilliant red made from vermilion or crushed insects signified the blood of martyrs and the fire of the Holy Spirit. Gold leaf applied with breathless care was not just shiny, it was the light of God made physical, reflecting candlelight in the dim church to make the page seem alive. Every hue was a word in a silent language. The art served a profound pedagogical purpose. In a world where few could read the Latin words, the pictures preached. A full-page miniature depicting the Last Judgment, with its vivid hierarchies of saints and sinners, could convey complex theological concepts more powerfully than a paragraph of text to a layperson. An ornate initial letter B at the beginning of the Book of Psalms might be woven into a scene of King David playing his harp, instantly identifying the text and connecting it to its traditional author. These images acted as mnemonic devices, memory palaces on parchment. A monk performing Lectio Divina would not just read the words of a gospel, he would meditate on the illuminated scene of the crucifixion that accompanied it, embedding the story in his mind through emotion and visual splendor. The intricate border patterns of vines, flowers, and fantastical creatures known as drolleries were more than whimsy. They often symbolized the ordered beauty of God's creation framing his revealed word, or they represented the chaotic earthly world being tamed by the sacred text at the page's center. This artistic investment also created a powerful economic and psychological barrier against loss or neglect. A plain text might be discarded if its contents fell out of favor. but a manuscript that represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor and a small fortune in imported pigments and gold became an irreplaceable treasure. It was a sacred object, a work of art, and a store of tangible value all in one. To destroy or carelessly lose such a book was unthinkable. The beauty protected the text. By transforming the manuscript from a container of information into a jewel of devotion, the illuminator guaranteed it would be handled with reverence, stored with care, and preserved with a passion that went far beyond its intellectual content. The page itself became a window not just to a story, but to a vision of a cosmos infused with divine order and radiant meaning. For centuries, the light of the scriptorium had been a flickering, isolated flame. Then, in the late 8th century, a king decided to turn that scattered glow into a beacon. Charlemagne, ruler of a vast empire stretching from modern France deep into Germany and Italy, possessed a vision that went far beyond the battlefield. He believed that a unified Christian empire required a unified, educated clergy, and that such an education depended on one thing: consistent, accurate books. His royal court became the unlikely engine for a cultural revival scholars would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, and its most lasting gift to the future was a new clarity in every written letter. This royal intervention did not replace the monastic scriptorium. It supercharged it with unprecedented resources and a clear, empire-wide mandate. Charlemagne issued a series of circular letters, known as capitularies, demanding educational reform across his land. He ordered bishops and abbots to establish schools for the training of clergy, insisting that these schools must teach not just piety, but proper grammar, computation, and music. For this to happen, they needed textbooks, and those textbooks needed to be reliable. The chaotic, regional variations of Latin script that had developed over centuries, scripts that were often cramped, idiosyncratic, and difficult for a traveler from another region to read, were now a political problem. A fragmented script meant a fragmented communication and a fragmented empire. So, Charlemagne and his chief scholarly advisor, a brilliant English monk named Alcuin of York, championed a solution: the creation and adoption of a new, standardized writing style, Carolingian minuscule. Imagine the difference. Before, a letter might look wildly different in a manuscript from Italy versus one from Gaul. Now, scribes across the empire were encouraged to adopt this new script, characterized by its clear, rounded, separated letters, its distinct uppercase and lowercase forms, and its generous use of space and punctuation. It was designed for legibility and ease of reading, a visual expression of Charlemagne's desire for clear communication and unified thought. This was not a minor aesthetic change. It was a revolution in information technology. The royal court became a hub for this project. Alcuin, recruited from the great library at York in England, headed the palace school at Aachen, turning the king's court into a center of scholarly activity. He and other intellectuals gathered the best manuscripts they could find, often from the monastic libraries of Italy or the British Isles, and began a systematic campaign of correction and copying. Teams of scribes, many of them monks brought to the court or working in favored imperial monasteries like St. Martin of Tours, where Alcuin later became abbot, were set to the task. Their mission was to produce definitive editions of key texts, the Bible above all, but also essential works of liturgy, church law, and the classical liberal arts. For the monastic scribe in a remote house who received one of these new, clean copies from the court, it was a transformative moment. His exemplar was no longer a centuries-old, error-ridden local copy. It was an authoritative version, sanctioned by the king and crafted by the best minds of the age. The directive from on high validated his daily labor, infusing it with a new sense of imperial purpose. The Carolingian minuscule script itself made his work faster and more consistent. The burst of energy was tangible. Manuscript production soared in quality and quantity. For a few generations, the isolated, persistent work of preservation was amplified by the concentrated power of a state. This fusion of royal authority and monastic discipline created a high watermark for early medieval learning. It proved that when stable political power actively partnered with the scriptorium's quiet machinery, the results could be spectacular. Yet this renaissance, brilliant as it was, remained fragile. It was built on the will of a single remarkable ruler and his immediate successors. When that centralized power eventually fractured, as all empires do, the monasteries would once again find themselves standing alone, their walls now sheltering not just the old knowledge, but the magnificent new standard that a king had helped them write. A single monastery, no matter how diligent, was a vulnerable fortress. Its library could burn, its scribes could fall to illness, or a local conflict could shatter its peace. For knowledge to survive the chaos of the early Middle Ages, it could not be kept in one place. It had to travel. And so, across the broken landscape of Europe, a quiet, resilient transmission network emerged, connecting isolated monastic communities into a continent-wide web of intellectual exchange. This network operated not through royal decrees, but through the deeply ingrained rhythms of monastic life itself. Its primary currency was the loan of the exemplar, the original manuscript from which copies were made. When an abbot in one region learned that a distant monastery possessed a rare text, he might send a trusted monk on a journey, carrying a precious book from his own library as a gesture of goodwill and a request to borrow the desired work. This was an act of immense trust, for the exemplar was often the monastery's only copy. The borrowing house would then set its scribes to work, creating a new duplicate before the precious original was returned. In this way, a single copy of a theological work by St. Augustine, held in a library in southern Gaul, could spawn identical twins in Swiss valleys and German forests over the course of a generation. The movement of people fueled this exchange just as much as the movement of books. Monks traveled for many reasons, all of which served to stitch this network tighter. They went on pilgrimage to sacred sites like Rome or Jerusalem, and they would often stop at renowned monasteries along the way, sharing news and texts. Scholar monks were sent on diplomatic missions between royal courts or to church councils, their minds and saddlebags carrying intellectual cargo. A young monk might be sent to study at a more famous monastic school, and when he returned home, he would bring back not just knowledge, but often physical copies of the texts that had shaped his education. The founding of new monasteries, known as daughter houses, created a powerful centrifugal force for spreading texts. When a community grew too large or was asked to establish a new abbey in a recently converted territory, it would send out a group of monks to form the core of the new foundation. They would take with them the essential books needed to establish their liturgical and intellectual life, a starter library that cloned the parent house's knowledge in a new location. We can see this network in action through specific currents of influence. From the twin monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow in northern England, the historical and theological works of the Venerable Bede began to circulate. Copies of his ecclesiastical history of the English people traveled with visiting clerics to the continent, where they were recopied in Frankish and Italian scriptoria, ensuring that the story of the English Church was preserved far from its island home. Similarly, Irish monastic centres like Iona, off the coast of Scotland, became luminous nodes in this web. Irish monks, renowned for their scholarship and missionary zeal, travelled extensively, founding houses from Burgundy to Bobbio in northern Italy. Each new foundation became a beachhead for the distinct Irish script and the unique texts they cherished, weaving Celtic Christian traditions into the broader European fabric. This decentralized, organic system provided a brilliant, redundant safeguard. A flood might destroy a library on a riverbank, but the texts it held lived on in copies housed in mountain abbeys hundreds of miles away. A political upheaval could silence one center of learning, but the ideas it cultivated had already taken root elsewhere. The network ensured that preservation was not a solitary act, but a collective, continent-wide project. No single point of failure could erase a text that had found a home in multiple hearts and multiple libraries. Yet, for all its resilience, this system faced a creeping, internal threat far subtler than fire or war: the slow, silent decay of the very language that bound this shared knowledge together. Yet for every text that survived, 100 others vanished forever. The Monastic Scriptorium was not a neutral archive, it was a filter shaped by faith, practicality, and the relentless pressure of limited resources. This quiet process of selection, repeated 1,000 times across 1,000 desks, determined the very shape of the future's memory. The librarian and the scribe made daily, pragmatic choices, and those choices had profound consequences. Their primary mission was to serve the Church, to strengthen the faith of the brethren, and to equip the monastery for its spiritual and practical duties. This theological lens meant that certain texts were copied with devotion, while others were allowed to fade into obscurity. The works of church fathers like Augustine and Jerome were reproduced endlessly, their orthodoxy guaranteeing their place on the copying schedule. Classical authors who could be read as moral or rhetorical guides, like Cicero or Virgil, often found a safe harbor, but a sprawling comedic play by the Roman writer Plautus, seen as frivolous entertainment, had a far slimmer chance of being prioritized over a new Psalter. A dense philosophical treatise by a Stoic thinker might be passed over if its arguments seemed to challenge Christian teachings on the soul. The result is a classical inheritance that is brilliant but fragmentary. We possess only a fraction of the plays written by the great Greek tragedians. Of the 120 plays Sophocles is believed to have written, only 7 have come down to us in complete form. The vibrant, often scandalous works of lyric poets like Sappho survive only in tantalizing snippets quoted by other authors. Even a giant like Aristotle is known to us incompletely. Historians note that many of his more popular dialogue-style works are lost, while his dense lecture notes, useful for scholarly training, were preserved. This was not an act of malicious destruction, but of gradual, silent neglect. In the harsh economy of the scriptorium, parchment, ink, and a scribe's labor were too precious to spend on a text that did not clearly serve the community's core mission. A manuscript that was not recopied before it decayed simply ceased to exist. Its words returned to silence. This filtering also applied to contemporary works. Local histories, vernacular poetry, and records of everyday life outside the cloister were rarely deemed worthy of the vellum and the time. The monastic lens gave us a profoundly spiritual and intellectual view of the medieval world, but it often left the voices of ordinary people, their stories and their songs unrecorded. Understanding this selective process is not a criticism of the monks, but a key to appreciating their achievement with clear eyes. They saved a civilization's core library under impossible conditions, but they could not save its entire bookstore. The legacy they passed forward was shaped by their needs, their beliefs, and the immense weight of their responsibility. Every page we can still read today represents a conscious choice made in a quiet room, a vote for that particular voice to speak across the centuries. And that leads us to a final, haunting question. As the medieval world slowly began to change, what would become of these fortress libraries when the storms of history finally began to subside? The bell shattered the deep silence of the night, a call to prayer long before the first hint of dawn. For the scribe monk, the day began not at his desk, but in the cold, dark choir of the church, joining his brothers for matins. This was the first of 8 sacred pauses that would structure his every hour, a cycle known as the Divine Office. Chanting psalms in the flickering candlelight, he was not yet a copyist, but a soul in communion, setting the spiritual tone for all that would follow. After the office, a brief period of private prayer or reading in the cloister might pass before the community gathered again for lauds, the morning praise, as the sky finally began to lighten. Only then, with the sun rising, would he move to the refectory for a simple, silent meal of bread, perhaps some porridge, and a cup of ale or watered wine, eaten while a brother read aloud from a holy text. His mind was being fed even as his body was sustained. The true work of the hand could now begin. Filing into the scriptorium, he would take his place at his assigned carrel, a small wooden desk facing the steady northern light. He would carefully arrange his tools, the prepared quills, the knife for trimming them, the inkhorn, the pumice stone for smoothing the vellum, and the ruler for guiding his lines. His most precious item was the exemplar, the book he was tasked with copying, fetched for him by the librarian from the secured collection. His work was not a solitary endeavor, but a link in a sacred chain, copying a text copied by generations before him for generations yet to come. The morning hours were for the most demanding labor, when his eyes were fresh and his concentration sharp. He worked in a profound, communal silence, broken only by the soft scratch of quills, the turning of a page, or the occasional request for a needed book, signaled by a formal hand gesture rather than speech. His entire world shrank to the line of text under his ruler and the growing line of letters on his own sheet. He did not read for story, he copied shapes, a deliberate discipline to prevent error. His back would ache, his fingers cramp, and his eyes strain, but the rhythm of the day offered relief. Mid-morning, the bell would ring again for the short office of terce. He would rise, lay down his quill, and file back to the church with his brothers. This forced break was a physical and mental salvation, stretching stiff limbs and refocusing a weary mind through collective prayer. Returning to the scriptorium, he might work until sext, the midday office, followed by the main meal of the day. The afternoon brought none, another prayer service, and then more hours at the desk as the light slowly began to soften. Each prayer service was a bracket, a recurring moment that lifted him out of the intense focus on the page and back into the shared purpose of the community. His labor was not separate from his worship, it was an extension of it. The copying was the laborer, the work that balanced the aura, the prayer. As the sun dipped lower, marking the approach of Vespers, the evening office, the light in the scriptorium would grow too dim for precise work. He would carefully clean his quill, cap his ink, and store the exemplar and his unfinished page. Vespers, sung as daylight faded, was a collective exhalation, a thanksgiving for the day's work offered to God. After a light supper and perhaps a period of spiritual reading in the chapter house, the cycle would close with Compline, the final prayers before the great silence of the night descended upon the monastery. Then to his simple cell for a few hours of rest, until the bell would once more call him from sleep to begin the cycle again. This seamless integration of manual and spiritual labor was the scriptorium's greatest strength. It provided the uninterrupted time, the protected environment, and the profound motivational framework that made long-term preservation possible. In the secular world outside, ravaged by uncertainty and the daily struggle for survival, such a luxury of focused, peaceful time simply did not exist. The monk's day was a masterpiece of intentional design, where every hour from the darkest night prayer to the last stroke of the pen served a single, unified purpose. The tool that transformed preservation was not just the pen, but the very shape of the book itself. While the classical world had written its laws and literature on long, horizontal scrolls made from Egyptian papyrus, the medieval monks perfected a different format, the Codex. This was not merely a stylistic choice, it was a profound technological upgrade that gave their rescue mission a critical edge. Imagine the difference. A scroll is a continuous roll, often many feet long. To read it, you must unroll it with one hand and roll it up with the other, a two-handed operation that makes quick reference or comparison nearly impossible. Finding a specific passage means scrolling and scanning, a slow and clumsy process that strains the delicate material. Papyrus itself, while excellent for its time, is fragile, susceptible to damp, tearing and crumbling over centuries, especially in the cooler, wetter climates of northern Europe. The Codex, in contrast, is what we recognize as a bound book. Sheets of durable parchment are folded, stacked, and sewn together at the spine, then protected between wooden boards. This design offered a cascade of practical advantages that aligned perfectly with monastic needs. First was durability. The parchment codex was tough. Its pages could be turned and handled without the same risk of cracking or tearing as a dry papyrus scroll. Its wooden covers protected the contents, and the whole object could be stored upright on a shelf or laid flat on a desk, taking up far less space than an equivalent text on scrolls. This compactness was a revelation. A single codex could hold the contents of multiple scrolls, consolidating knowledge into a portable, manageable package. But the most revolutionary advantage was random access. A monk studying scripture no longer had to laboriously unwind a 20-foot scroll to compare a prophecy in Isaiah with its fulfillment in the Gospel of Matthew. He could simply flip from one page to another, using his finger to mark a place while he consulted a different section. This made the Codex an ideal tool for scholarly study, theological debate, and liturgical practice, where cross-referencing was essential. Furthermore, the Codex utilized both sides of the writing surface, a practice generally avoided with papyrus scrolls due to the visibility of ink bleed through. This doubled the information density of every precious sheet of parchment, a crucial economic efficiency. The early Christian communities had, in fact, been among the first to widely adopt the Codex format for their sacred texts, perhaps to distinguish their scriptures from Jewish and pagan scrolls, or for the practical ease of carrying and sharing the Gospels. The monasteries inherited and then perfected this format. In the Scriptorium, the creation of a codex was a coordinated craft, involving the parchment maker, the scribe, the illuminator, and finally the bookbinder, who sewed the gatherings together and anchored them to sturdy oak boards often covered with leather. The result was a resilient cultural capsule, an object designed to withstand time and use. The choice to standardize the codex was therefore a silent, strategic decision for permanence. It meant that the knowledge they saved was not only copied accurately, but also housed in the most robust and user-friendly information technology the world had yet devised. The classical scroll, suited to the libraries of sunny Mediterranean cities, faded with those cities. The Codex, born of practical necessity and refined in the monastic workshop, was built for the long, uncertain journey ahead. Latin was not a dead language in the Scriptorium. It was a living, breathing discipline. Outside the monastery walls, the spoken word was transforming. The common Latin of the Roman legions and marketplaces, known as Vulgar Latin, was slowly evolving into the early forms of what would become Italian, French, Spanish, and the other Romance languages. This was a natural, organic process, but for the scribe, it presented a profound danger. If the written language of scripture and scholarship were to follow this path of change, a text copied in one century might become incomprehensible to a reader in the next. The very tool for understanding the past would be lost, so the monastic scribe became, by necessity, a linguistic guardian. His daily labor was an act of linguistic conservation. By meticulously copying the classical and late Latin of the Church Fathers and approved ancient authors, he was not just preserving ideas, he was freezing a grammatical moment in time. He replicated the syntax, the vocabulary, and the stylistic rhythms of a standardized written Latin that was increasingly divorced from everyday speech. This created a powerful anchor. Across Europe, from Ireland to the Alps, a scholar-monk in any monastery could open a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions or a volume of Cicero's letters and encounter the same grammatical structures, the same core vocabulary. This written Latin became the indispensable lingua franca, the common tongue of law, theology, and intellectual exchange for a fragmented continent. It allowed a bishop in Canterbury to correspond authoritatively with the Pope in Rome, and a legal decree issued by a Frankish king to be understood by administrators in distant provinces. The monastery's walls protected not just books but the very code needed to decipher them. Yet this task required more than passive copying. Monks actively worked to reinforce this linguistic standard. They composed and copied grammatical textbooks, drawing directly from the Roman grammarians like Donatus and Priscian. These works were not dry academic exercises, they were essential training manuals for every new scribe. A young monk learned his Latin not from the street, but from these prescribed rules, ensuring that every generation of copyists entered the scriptorium with the same foundational understanding. Even more practically, they created glossaries. In the margins of difficult texts or in dedicated notebooks, they would write explanations of rare or archaic Latin words, often providing a simpler synonym or a definition in their own emerging vernacular. A monk in a German monastery might scribble the Old High German equivalent above a complex Latin term, a tiny act of translation that secured the word's meaning for future local readers. This practice of glossing created a living bridge between the fixed language of the text and the changing language of the mind. The most famous of these projects, the Glossa Ordinaria, was a vast compilation of marginal and interlinear commentaries on the entire Bible, assembled from the work of generations of scholars. It became the standard reference, ensuring that theological interpretation remained tied to a stable Latin text. Through this dual mission of replication and explanation, the Scriptoria performed a miracle of continuity. They maintained an unbroken thread of linguistic comprehension that stretched from the late Roman world, through the so-called Dark Ages, and into the bright dawn of the medieval universities in the 12th century. When scholars at the University of Paris or Bologna debated Aristotle's logic, they did so in the same Latin that had been carefully curated and preserved on monastic parchment for 500 years. The ideas had survived because the language to frame them had never been allowed to die. This silent, grammatical vigilance was perhaps their most subtle and far-reaching achievement. They saved the words, and in doing so, they saved the world those words described. While continental scribes worked in the shadow of crumbling Roman walls, a different kind of light was being kindled on the very edge of the known world. In the green, rain-swept isolation of Ireland, a monastic culture flourished with an intensity that would leave an indelible mark on Europe's memory. Sheltered by distance from the worst of the invasions and political collapses shaking the mainland, these communities became something extraordinary, peripheral powerhouses of learning that operated with a unique independence and creative fire. Irish monks embraced a concept of pilgrimage they called peregrinatio, a permanent exile for the love of God. This was not a journey to a specific shrine and back, but a lifelong wandering, a commitment to leave homeland and kin to found new communities in the wilderness. This spiritual restlessness made them Europe's greatest intellectual itinerants. A monk from Bangor or Clonmacnoise might feel called to take his books and his skills across the sea, establishing a new monastery on a remote Scottish island like Iona, or venturing deep into the forests of Gaul. Each new foundation became a beachhead not of conquest but of scholarship, a fresh node in that fragile network preserving knowledge. Their scriptoria produced works of staggering beauty and complexity, none more famous than the Book of Kells. This illuminated gospel book, likely created on Iona around the year 800, represents the zenith of their artistic devotion. Its pages are a riot of intricate, almost microscopic detail, swirling with vibrant colors and patterns that seem to move. Celtic knots with no beginning and no end symbolize eternity. Interlaced animals and figures weave through the sacred text, not as mere decoration, but as a visual meditation, inviting the reader to lose themselves in the wonder of the divine word. The labor behind a single page is almost incomprehensible. a testament to a culture that viewed the book as a primary conduit for encountering the holy. But their contribution was far more than aesthetic. Because Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire, its monks approached the Latin classical heritage with a unique, hungry curiosity. They were not inheritors of a living Roman tradition, they were discoverers of a lost treasure. Texts that had fallen out of circulation or were deemed less useful on the continent were copied and studied in Irish monasteries with passionate interest. This included works of Greek learning, often accessed through complex chains of translation, and Latin authors whose writings were elsewhere neglected. The real impact of this Irish fervor was felt when these scholar missionaries returned to the continent. Figures like Columbanus, born in Leinster in the 6th century, traveled to Burgundy and later Italy, founding influential monasteries like Lectio and Bobbio. He and his followers did not arrive empty-handed. They brought libraries in their saddlebags, precious codices containing not only scripture and Irish devotional texts, but also those preserved classical works. The monastery at Bobbio, founded in the Italian Apennines, would later become renowned for its vast and ancient library, a direct infusion of Irish collected knowledge into the heart of Europe. In this way, the remote Irish and Scottish monasteries acted as a cultural backup disk. They saved files that were in danger of being deleted from the continental mainframe. Then, through the deliberate wandering of their monks, they performed a critical restoration, re-injecting lost texts and a renewed scribal energy back into a struggling system. Their disproportionate role reminds us that in the geography of knowledge, the periphery can sometimes become the most vital center, safeguarding the very things the core has forgotten how to value. The master scribe watched the boy's hand, not the letter it was trying to form. A young novice, perhaps only 12 or 13, sat with a sharp stylus poised over a wooden tablet filled with smooth, dark beeswax. His task was not to copy a psalm, but to master a single, fundamental curve, the rounded bowl of a lowercase a in the Carolingian minuscule script. This was the true beginning of every book, not with ink on parchment, but with a hesitant groove in wax. The scriptorium's future depended on this quiet, patient transfer of skill from one generation to the next. Preservation was a chain, and every link had to be forged by hand. To ensure the work never stopped, the monastery had to become its own school, an engine for replicating the scribes themselves. The education began with the absolute basics. A new arrival, having left the secular world behind, first had to learn to read Latin, the sacred language of the texts he would one day copy. This was often done orally through the daily rhythm of the divine office. By chanting the psalms and listening to readings during meals, his ear became attuned to the sounds and rhythms of the language. Parallel to this, his formal instruction would start with the alphabet, learning the names and shapes of letters from a simple hornbook or a chart. But reading was only half the battle. He had to learn to make the letters himself. For this, he was given a wax tablet. This reusable surface was the perfect training ground. Mistakes were not costly. A gentle warmth from the hand or a quick pass of the flat end of the stylus could smooth the wax and offer a fresh start. Under the watchful eye of the master scribe or an older monk assigned as his instructor, the novice would practice strokes, then individual letters, then whole words, building the muscle memory and discipline required for the sacred craft. This apprenticeship was slow and hierarchical, mirroring the monastery's own structure of obedience and gradual advancement. The master scribe was not just a teacher of technique, he was a model of the scribal spirit, patience, precision, and devotion. The novice learned by observation, by correction, and by endless repetition. He would progress from copying simple prayers and psalms he already knew by heart on his wax tablet to writing with ink on scraps of parchment or in the margins of older, less important manuscripts. Only after years of this rigorous training, when his hand was steady and his understanding of abbreviations and script forms was secure, would he be entrusted with a fresh sheet of pristine vellum and a valuable exemplar from the library. His first real copying assignment might be a small, practical text, like a portion of the monastic rule or a liturgical calendar, something important but not as theologically weighty as a gospel. Every step was a test of character as much as skill. This internal education system solved the most practical problem of preservation, a continuous supply of skilled labor. But it did something far more profound. It embedded the sacred purpose of the work into the very bones of each new scribe. The novice did not just learn how to shape an A, he learned why that mattered. He understood that his labor was a form of prayer, a service to his community and to God. The craft, with all its physical hardship and mental discipline, became inseparable from his spiritual identity. This ensured that the tradition was not just maintained but internalized and revered. The scriptorium, therefore, was not merely a workshop or a library, it was a living lineage. Each perfectly formed letter on a page centuries old is the direct descendant of a shaky line scored into wax by a young monk under the soft light of a tallow lamp. A chain of knowledge passed from one careful hand to the next, guaranteeing that the light of learning would never flicker out for lack of someone to tend it. The sea, which had once brought pilgrims and traders, now brought a new and terrifying kind of visitor. The monastic ideal of peaceful seclusion was about to face its most violent test. From the late 8th century onward, the long, swift ships of Norse raiders began to appear off the coasts of the British Isles and Francia. These were not armies seeking land, at least not at first, but lightning strikes of plunder. And the monasteries, often built on isolated, undefended islands or coastal headlands for their solitude, made tragically perfect targets. They were warehouses of portable wealth, filled with the very objects the scriptorium produced: jeweled book covers, silver liturgical vessels, and gold from altar crosses. The attack on the island monastery of Lindisfarne in the year 793 sent a shockwave of horror through the Christian world. A contemporary chronicler described it as a devastation of heathen men, lamenting that they trampled the holy places and dug up the altars. This was more than a robbery, it was a desecration of the sacred quiet where knowledge lived. The paradox is stark and painful. The very remoteness that protected the monastery from political turmoil now left it exposed to pirates. The same treasures that celebrated the divine word now attracted those who would burn it. For decades, these raids were a recurring nightmare along the northern and western coasts. A community might spend a century copying, illuminating, and praying, only to see its work reduced to ash and splinters in a single day of violence. The physical cost was immense: buildings burned, libraries destroyed, and the lives of monks lost. It seemed like an existential threat, a force that could erase the patient work of generations in one fiery afternoon. Yet, the system they had built proved to be more resilient than any single stone wall. When the lookout's cry echoed across the cloister, warning of dragon-prowed ships on the horizon, the brothers did not just stand and pray, they had a plan. Their most precious treasures were not the stone buildings but the books. The community would gather its most vital manuscripts, the Gospels, the Psalters, the rare classical texts, and flee. Sometimes they fled inland to temporary shelters, other times to other, more defensible monasteries. The famous Book of Kells itself is believed to have been created on Iona, but was moved to the inland monastery of Kells in Ireland for safekeeping after repeated Viking threats. The book became a refugee, its journey a testament to the mobility of knowledge. This points to the deeper, brilliant redundancy of the monastic network. A Viking raid could obliterate Lindisfarne's library, but it could not erase the texts that had already traveled. Years before the raid, scribes from Lindisfarne had exchanged copies of the Gospels with houses further inland. Monks from Lindisfarne had founded other communities, taking books with them as founding gifts. The intellectual content of that library existed in other places, in other scriptoria, safe behind different mountains or rivers. No single monastery held the only copy of anything truly important. The knowledge was distributed like a cultural immune system. If one node was attacked and fell, the information lived on in a dozen others. And sometimes, against all odds, the communities themselves returned. After the immediate danger passed, monks would come back to the charred ruins. They would bury their lost brothers with reverence, clear the debris, and begin again. They would send for copies of the texts they had lost from sister monasteries, and the slow, patient work of the scriptorium would resume, a quiet act of defiance against chaos. The stones might be blackened, but the chain of transmission remained unbroken. The Viking raids were a brutal demonstration of the system's fragility, but also, ultimately, of its astonishing durability. They tested the network to its limits and found that the light of learning, though scattered and forced into hiding, could not be so easily snuffed out. It simply moved and waited and began again. The quiet of the cloister had preserved the fuel, but a new fire was now ready to burn in the heart of the city. By the 12th century, a profound shift was underway. The slow, steady work of the monasteries had created a critical mass, a recovered library of ancient thought now waiting for a new kind of reader. In the bustling, growing cities of Europe, a fresh intellectual hunger began to stir. This was not a rejection of the monastic world, but its direct and logical consequence. The seeds carefully tended in remote scriptoria were about to sprout in an entirely new landscape, the medieval university. Places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford became magnets for masters and students, drawn together by a thirst for structured debate and advanced learning. But what did these scholars debate? Their entire curriculum was built upon the very texts the monks had spent centuries preserving and copying. The foundational texts for the study of theology were the Bible and the voluminous commentaries of church fathers like Augustine and Jerome, all standardized and disseminated from monastic libraries. The revived study of law, both canon and civil, depended on the meticulous copies of Roman legal codes like the Justinian Code, which had survived in monastic collections. Most transformative of all was the rediscovery of Aristotle. His works on logic, metaphysics, and natural science, preserved in part through Arabic translations and then faithfully copied by monks, exploded into the university consciousness. These texts provided the rigorous intellectual tools and the provocative questions that fueled scholasticism, the dominant scholarly method of the age. Professors like Peter Abelard in Paris did not invent their material from thin air. They applied razor-sharp logic to the authoritative texts laid before them, texts that existed only because of the scribe's unbroken chain. The university, with its lectures, disputations, and degrees, represented a new model of learning, communal, urban, and contentious. Yet its lifeblood was old, flowing directly from parchment that had been prepared in silent rooms a continent away. The monk in his scriptorium had been the guardian, but the university scholar became the interpreter, using that preserved inheritance to ask new questions and build towering systems of thought. This was the ultimate validation of the monastic mission. They had not merely stored books in a vault, they had kept the very habit of scholarship alive through the darkest centuries, maintaining the language, the techniques, and the reverence for the written word. When political stability and economic growth finally made large, secular centers of learning possible again, the foundation was already there, fully stocked and ready for use. The Renaissance of the 12th century, with its leaps in philosophy, science, and law, was not a sudden miracle. It was the harvest of a planting that had begun 500 years earlier, when a monk first smoothed a sheet of vellum and lifted his pen in a beam of northern light, ensuring that the conversation of civilization would one day find its voice again. That same impulse to preserve against the tide of forgetting now hums silently inside vast, climate-controlled server farms. the medieval scriptorium has found its modern echo not in stone cloisters, but in the digital realm where communities of volunteers and experts perform a strikingly similar act of faith for the future. Consider the tireless editor on Wikipedia correcting a citation late into the night. They receive no salary, their name is often just a username, and their work is driven by a shared belief that accurate, accessible knowledge is a public good. This mirrors the monastic scribe who copied a medical text not for personal glory, but so that the infirmarian could heal the sick. Both are participants in a decentralized, collective project where the reward is the preservation itself. The core parallel is profound. Just as a remote monastery served as a redundant node in a fragile network, ensuring a text survived if another library burned, today's digital archivists create multiple copies across distributed servers. They fight a new kind of entropy, not the decay of parchment, but the obsolescence of file formats and the collapse of digital platforms. Their work is a constant migration, moving data from aging hard drives to new clouds, translating it into new code, much like a scribe would recopy a crumbling manuscript onto fresh vellum before the old one became illegible. The open-source software developer, writing and debugging lines of code that are then freely shared for anyone to use, improve, and adapt, continues the monastic tradition of glossing and commentary. They build upon a shared foundation, leaving transparent records of their changes for the next contributor, ensuring the tool remains viable and trustworthy. These modern endeavors reveal that the drive to safeguard our collective memory is a deeply human constant. The medieval scribe bent over his desk by candlelight, and the modern data curator, scanning a fragile book into a high-resolution digital file, are united by the same quiet mission. They are guardians against a different kind of dark age, one of digital rot or information overload that obscures truth. This perspective transforms our view of history. It asks us to see the ancient scribe not as a curious artifact, but as a direct professional ancestor. His meticulous care, his community ethics, and his long-term vision are the very bedrock of our modern information ecology. In an age where data can vanish with a click or a corporate decision, the monastic model of distributed, principled, and community-driven preservation feels less like a relic and more like a timelessly relevant blueprint. It reminds us that saving the light of understanding has always required, more than anything, dedicated hands willing to do the work. Perched high on a rocky hilltop south of Rome, the Abbey of Monte Cassino was more than a monastery. It was a living symbol of the entire preservation project. Saint Benedict himself chose this formidable, isolated site in the year 529, seeking a wilderness where his new rule could take root. Here, in this cradle of Benedictine life, the scriptorium was not an added feature. It was woven into the community's identity from the very beginning. The abbey quickly became a beacon, attracting scholars and accumulating one of the most significant libraries in early medieval Europe. Its scribes copied not only the rule and liturgical books, but also the works of the Latin Church Fathers and, crucially, classical texts that had survived the Roman collapse in Italy. For generations, Monte Cassino stood as a fortress of learning, its library shelves growing heavier with the weight of preserved wisdom. Then, in the year 577, the unthinkable happened. The Lombard invasion swept through the region. The abbey, for all its spiritual strength, was not a military castle. The Lombards sacked and burned it, scattering the community and reducing its physical memory to ash and rubble. Imagine the loss not just of buildings but of unique manuscripts, perhaps the only copies of certain texts in all of Italy, gone in the smoke. This moment captures the terrifying fragility of the entire endeavor. A century of careful copying could be erased in a single day of conflict, yet the story does not end there. This is where the tenacity of the monastic model revealed its true power. The monks did not vanish. They regrouped, first in Rome, carrying with them whatever knowledge was in their minds and the few texts they might have saved. For over a century they lived in exile, but they maintained their communal identity and their purpose. Then, in the early 8th century, they returned. They climbed back up that rocky hill and began the slow, monumental task of rebuilding, stone by stone, book by book. This cycle of destruction and return became a defining rhythm. Monte Cassino would be damaged again by Saracen raids in the 9th century and by an earthquake in the 14th. Yet each time the community returned to restore, rebuild, and recopy. Their library was not a static vault, it was a phoenix repeatedly rising from its own ashes. By the 11th and 12th centuries, under the enlightened leadership of abbots like Desiderius, Monte Cassino entered a new golden age. Its scriptorium became famous for a distinctive, elegant script and for breathtaking illuminated manuscripts, like the magnificent lectionary made for Abbot Desiderius himself, a book shimmering with gold and azure. Its scribes actively sought out rare classical texts from the surrounding regions, copying works of Roman history, medicine, and law that might otherwise have been lost. The abbey became a crucial bridge, preserving the classical heritage of the Italian peninsula and feeding it northward into the emerging intellectual currents of Europe. The long history of Monte Cassino, therefore, is a microcosm of the entire medieval struggle. It shows us the ever-present threat of loss, the heartbreaking reality that so much was irrevocably destroyed. But it also demonstrates the relentless, generational commitment to recovery. The monks did not preserve knowledge because it was easy, they did it precisely because it was so perilously hard. Their vow of stability was not just to a place, but to an idea that the light they tended on that mountain was worth relighting, no matter how many times the winds of history blew it out. The scribe's final stroke was not always the last word of the text. Sometimes, in the quiet margin at the bottom of the page, he would add a few lines of his own. These were not part of the sacred scripture or the classical treatise. They were a whisper from the man behind the pen, a fleeting break in the disciplined silence. These brief notes are called Colophons, and they are our most direct human connection to the anonymous hands that built the medieval world's memory. In a project defined by self-effacing duty, these rare personal marks feel like a crack in a stone wall, letting in a sudden, intimate light. One scribe, finishing a long gospel in a cold scriptorium, might simply write, "The end of the book. Thanks be to God." Another, perhaps with tired eyes and a stiff back, would add a humble plea, "Whoever shall read this book, pardon me for the errors you may find, for the hand of the scribe is not the hand of the mind." He knew his human fallibility was part of the process, and he asked not for praise, but for forgiveness from future readers he would never meet. These notes often carried practical details that anchor the work in a real life. A monk might record the date, the place, or the name of the abbot who commissioned the work, but sometimes the weariness of the labor itself broke through. One famous colophon from a 9th century Irish manuscript reads with stark simplicity, "The bitter wind is fierce tonight, it ruffles the ocean's white hair. I fear no wild Viking sailing the quiet sea, only the keen wind that makes the pens shake in my hand." Here, the distant threat of raiders is secondary to the immediate, physical challenge of the cold, a detail so vivid we can almost feel the draft 700 years later. Other scribes reached for humor or mild complaint to break the monotony. "Three fingers write, but the whole body labors," one noted, acknowledging the all-consuming strain of the posture. Another, perhaps at the end of an exceptionally difficult text, wrote, "Now I've written the whole thing, for Christ's sake give me a drink." These glimpses remind us that this was not a mechanical process performed by faceless drones. It was accomplished by individuals with sore necks, cold fingers, and a thirst for something other than ink. the most poignant colophons are prayers, not for the scribe's own soul, but for the soul of the reader. May the reader's blessing be upon the writer, one asks, tying his legacy directly to the act of reading itself. Another finishes with, whoever you are who take this book in your hands, remember the scribe Jaroslav. For a moment, the anonymity lifts and a single name, Jaroslav, steps out of the shadows, asking only to be remembered in the reader's thoughts. This is the profound truth these marginal whispers reveal. The vast continent-saving project of preservation was not an abstract historical force. It was the sum of thousands of daily acts of patience, each one a small victory over discomfort, distraction, and time. Every perfectly copied page we still read today represents a specific afternoon, a specific monk, a specific decision to continue rather than to stop. Their legacy is immortal, but their experience was intensely human, a quiet dialogue between duty and fatigue, faith and cold fingers, etched in the same ink that saved a world. The very parchment under the scribe's hand was engineered for eternity. Its survival is not an accident of history, but a quiet triumph of medieval material science, a deliberate choice for permanence in every fiber and formula. To understand why we can still read these books today, we must look past the words to the physical chemistry of the page itself. The foundation was parchment, a material far more resilient than the papyrus of antiquity or the paper that would follow. Made from the carefully prepared skin of calves, sheep, or goats, parchment is essentially a network of collagen, a protein that is incredibly stable and resistant to decay. Unlike plant-based paper, which provides a food source for mold and insects, animal skin offered a much less hospitable environment for biological attackers. The intensive scraping and liming process during its creation removed fats and other organic materials that would otherwise rot, leaving behind a purified, durable sheet. When stored in the cool, dry, stable environment of a monastic library or a church treasury, this collagen matrix could remain flexible and intact for well over 1,000 years. It could survive dampness that would dissolve papyrus and outlast the brittle fragility that plagues modern wood pulp paper. The scribe's ink was its perfect partner. The standard ink of the scriptorium was iron gall ink, a sophisticated chemical recipe. It was made by combining tannic acid, extracted from oak galls, with iron sulfate, often from rusted nails soaked in vinegar. When mixed, these ingredients form a soluble, pale liquid, but the magic happens upon contact with the parchment. As the scribe writes, the iron ions in the ink react with the tannins and, critically, with the air. This oxidation process creates insoluble iron galatanate pigments that literally bond with the collagen fibers of the parchment. The ink doesn't just sit on the surface, it becomes part of the material itself, sinking in and creating a stain that is extraordinarily difficult to remove. This chemical marriage is why the blackletter text on a medieval charter remains stark and legible centuries later, even if the parchment is stained or worn. The final layer of defense was the book's very architecture, the bound Codex. Those sturdy oak boards covered in thick leather and sometimes fitted with metal clasps acted as protective armor. They shielded the vulnerable pages within from dust, light, and physical abrasion. The Codex format kept the pages flat and under gentle, even pressure, preventing the cockling and warping that can damage loose sheets. This entire system, the stable parchment, the bonding ink, the armored binding, created a time capsule of remarkable integrity. Now contrast this with our own era's primary mediums. Much of the paper produced from the 19th century onward is highly acidic, derived from wood pulp. This acidity slowly eats away at the paper's own fibers, causing it to yellow, become brittle, and eventually crumble to dust in a process often called slow fire. Libraries today spend millions battling this inherent decay. And what of our digital legacy? We store our collective knowledge on hard drives and servers, media subject to a different kind of fragility, format obsolescence, magnetic degradation, and the simple failure of hardware. A parchment codex from the year 900 can be picked up and read with the naked eye, no special device or software required. A floppy disk from 1990 is already an unreadable artifact for most people. This contrast prompts a sobering reflection. The medieval scribe, with his seemingly primitive tools, was building for a future he would never see, investing immense labor into objects meant to last for ages. Our modern world creates information at a staggering, unprecedented rate, but often on the most ephemeral of platforms. What will remain of our digital civilization 1,000 years from now? The silent endurance of the medieval manuscript offers a profound lesson in intentional legacy. It asks us to consider not just what we are recording, but what we are building it to withstand. The true test of knowledge is not its immediate utility, but its ability to whisper across the centuries. That final stroke of the quill, that last whispered prayer in the margin, was never the end of the story. It was a message in a bottle, cast into the deep ocean of time by hands that believed in a future they would never see. The quiet, diligent work in the Monastic Scriptorium was nothing less than a rescue mission for Western civilization, a deliberate act of hope against a backdrop of decline. We have walked through their silent, lamplit world and seen how these communities, through sacred mission, clever design, economic resilience, and sheer human patience, built an ark for the mind. They were not passive curators of a dying past. They were active engineers of a future memory. Their walls were not a retreat from the world, but a fortress built specifically to protect the world's most fragile and essential cargo, its ideas. They understood in their bones that a civilization is more than its cities or its armies. It is a conversation across generations, and that conversation cannot continue if the words are lost. Their legacy, therefore, is not confined to museum display cases or the precious, jeweled covers of gospel books. It lives, breathing and active, in places we might not immediately see. It lives in every university lecture where a professor explains Aristotle's logic, a text chain kept unbroken by 1,000 anonymous copies. It resonates in every modern legal argument that traces its roots back to principles of Roman law, principles preserved on monastic parchment when no secular court cared to remember them. It hums in the background of every scientific inquiry, a discipline built upon the ancient foundations of geometry, astronomy, and observational reason that these scribes kept in circulation. The very structure of our intellectual world, with its reliance on written authority, cross-reference, and cumulative knowledge, is a direct inheritance from the scriptorium's model. They taught us how to save a library, and in doing so, they taught us how to build a ladder to the stars. As we navigate our own era, one defined not by scarcity of information, but by its overwhelming flood, and not by the decay of parchment, but by the frightening fragility of digital formats, their story speaks with urgent clarity. It reminds us that preserving knowledge is never a passive or automatic process. It is an active, intentional, and profoundly human duty. It requires choices about what is valuable. It demands the creation of systems, both physical and social, to protect that value, and it relies, ultimately, on the commitment of individuals who believe that the work matters more than the immediate reward. The light in the scriptorium was a small one, but it was kept burning through a long night. Our challenge today is different, but the essential question remains the same. What are we doing to ensure the most vital lights of our own time continue to shine for those who come after us? If you found this journey into the quiet power of preservation enlightening, I invite you to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden pillars of history. And I would love to hear your thoughts. What knowledge, what stories, or what ideas do you believe are most vital for us to preserve today? Share your perspective in the comments below.